Welcome to the Lovers Lounge podcast, where we talk to experts and other guests on topics related to love, relationships, and sex. I am your host, Tina Love, and on this episode, we're going to be talking to another Tina, Dr. Tina Schermer-Sellers. Now, listen to this. She is a certified sex therapist, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and is the founder and medical director of the Northwest Institute on Intimacy in Seattle, Washington. Now, she's also an author of the book Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, Erasing Shame from Sexual Intimacy. Welcome, Tina, to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
I am so glad that you are here. This has been something that I've been very interested in talking with somebody about ever since I started this show, like a few months ago. And just happened
Mhm.
to run across your information. And I was listening to another podcast where you talked to somebody, and I was so happy and so thrilled, and just couldn't wait to invite you to come on the Lovers Lounge podcast. So I'm really glad that you're able to come.
Great. So glad to be here.
Yeah. So anyway, you have a very interesting book, but before we get into the book, Sex, God, the Conservative
Yeah.
Church, Erasing Shame and Sexual Assault, I'd like to find out, kind of a little bit more about you. I talked a little bit in the intro about you, but what led
Huh.
you to write this book?
Yeah. Well, I often say that I didn't decide like that I just was a little rebellious person that I wanted to take on the church. Like I don't recommend to people to do that, and that wasn't what I intended to do. But I was really compelled to write this book. I happened to have the good fortune of growing up in a Swedish immigrant home that was very body positive and sex positive and just a real pretty loving home. We had our quirks for sure.
Right.
Don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but it was a Northern European family, and in Europe, in sort of the Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, um, Holland, even areas, they have had comprehensive sex education for, I don't even know, 60 years at
Right.
least,
Right.
or more than that, 80 maybe. And so, uh, talking about sexuality and bodies and relationships and intimacies is really woven into culture, kind of like talking about health and recipes and life.
Right. Right.
And so in my family, that's really the way that it was. And I didn't know that my family was different or goofy, and that every family wasn't like mine until I was well into my 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to college and taught junior high and high school. And when I was teaching those grades, I became aware that kids really were facing a lot of difficult challenges at home with, just all kinds of things, abuse and drugs and whatever. And because of that, I decided I wanted to go back to grad school and study family therapy, that if I could intervene at the family level, that would really be something that to me would be meaningful.
Okay.
And so I went to grad school to do that. And while I was there, and actually right after I graduated, one of my professors invited me to teach the human sexuality course at the graduate school that I had just graduated from. He knew that I had taught at the junior high and high school level human sexuality, and thought that it would be great if there was a male and a female that was teaching that graduate level course. And I jumped at the chance. I thought that would be fabulous
Mm-hmm.
to teach it. And so I actually started teaching in the same program that I had just graduated from. And this was way back in 1991 and or early 92. And I continued teaching in that program and eventually became part time and then full time. And one of the assignments that I had my students do, and this was actually an assignment that I did as well, was write their sexual autobiography. And when I say that to people, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine having to commit my sexual story to paper.
Right.
But, when you're becoming a therapist, you really want your therapist to know their stories, the stories of their life. And in our program, that was a really important thing to us. We believe that you're only ever as good a therapist as you know what your stories are. Your family of origin story, your gender story, ethnicity stories, your medical stories, your sexuality story.
Yeah.
And so when they would take this class, that was an important story I would have them write. And so I would give them upwards 60, 70 questions as a guide to help them reflect back into their generations, and then walk through their childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and really think about what they had been taught and what they had experienced, what they had felt, what they had longed for. And they would often say to me, my students, that this was one of the most difficult papers that they had written, but one of the most important papers that they had written.
I can imagine.
And yeah. And, in our country, we don't have comprehensive sex education. In fact, we began to withdraw any sex education back in the early 80s when we began to teach quote unquote abstinence education.
Yes.
And we also began to withdraw any money that we had for sex research as well.
Right.
And so one of the things that I began to notice about the year 2000, so at this point I'd been teaching the class about 8 or 9 years, was that the tone of these autobiographies began to dramatically shift. Now, the students weren't describing having experienced things different or having felt differently or longed for different things, but the way that they described how they felt about themselves began to shift. So they began to describe really hating themselves, feeling horrible disgust and humiliation about themselves.
Yeah.
Even though what they were describing having done or wanted to do or felt or desired was all within the same range of what I had been reading for years and years.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't figure out why they were really hating themselves so much more. And I remember the first year I was just in tears. And then the next year it was the same. And the next year it was the same. And I would go into my chair of my department's office and just weep because I just wasn't sure what I was seeing. And it was so horrible. So I began to ask my students more questions, like, tell me more about your adolescence and what you were being told and what you were, experiencing just in your environment.
Right.
And what I began to finally piece together was that I was hitting the first wave of students that were being taught this abstinence-only education in their public schools, and the first wave of students where they had come from a conservative evangelical background or conservative religious background, were getting taught very restrictive things in their youth groups.
Okay.
So things like, they would begin to tell me stories of things like going to their youth group, and as they would be sitting around in circles, someone would pass around a piece of pizza, and they would all be told to take a bite of the piece of pizza. The piece of pizza was going around, and then the youth leader would be telling them, if you long to be sexual with somebody, if you desire to be sexual with somebody, if you act in some sexual way, you'll be giving yourself away in some way that you will tarnish yourself and you will tarnish your relationship with God. And
Mm.
so they would hear these things. And then as the piece of pizza would come around, the youth leader at the end would hold it up, and all that would be left would be the crust of the pizza.
Yeah.
And they would say, "This is what you'll be giving to your future partner." Or they would pass around a flower, and they'd all be told to pluck off one of the petals.
Oh
Or
my God.
they would pass around an empty cup, and they'd all be told to spit in the cup.
Oh my
Or
God.
they would all be given a piece of foil that would have been wrapped off and ripped off, and then they would be told to take the foil and crush it into a ball, and then undo it and try to make it flat again, and then they would be told, "See how you can't make it like it originally was when it was just first torn off.
Wow.
That's how you will be. You will not be able to be restored either."
So,
And these kinds of really dramatic things, or glue two contrasting colors of paper together, and then
trying
while
to
the person
pull them
was
apart.
talking,
Yeah.
then at the end it would be, yeah, and then pull them apart. And so I would hear from my students, "I feel like damaged goods, like
Yeah.
no one can possibly love me, and for sure God can't love me.
Wow.
So I am unworthy of being loved." And so it wasn't just what they had done or even not done, it was what they had felt and what they had desired, right? And so it's both the longings and the desires and the actions, right? And of course, we could perhaps keep ourselves from doing actions, but our thoughts are things that are pretty natural, and our feelings are things that are pretty natural.
Right.
And as soon as you hit your adolescence, you are going to naturally begin feeling and thinking things,
Right.
because I believe we are hardwired for connection and pleasure, that God made us this way
Right.
to desire connection and pleasure. And so these people who were taught these things, whether in their public schools or in their youth groups, or both, they really believed that they could keep themselves from feeling these things or thinking these things. And then when they couldn't, or when they would act, they would fall in love with somebody, and they would act in some way where they would express their love for somebody. They would condemn themselves
Yeah.
to high heaven, and they would believe that other people were able to keep themselves from doing these things, because of course they didn't talk to each other,
Yeah.
right? So they would look at other people and they would go, "That person over there, they are able to keep themselves from thinking these things or feeling these things or doing these things, but me,
Yeah.
I'm not.
So it
And
was,
so
yeah.
I must be perverted." Yeah.
Yeah. Or it was almost like they felt like there was something wrong with them. Like you said, felt like they were damaged
Right.
goods. Something's wrong with me.
Yeah.
And a lot of condemnation, I guess, inner condemnation,
Right.
and just
Yeah.
beating themselves up over something that
Right.
really developmentally is quite normal. It can happen.
Natural.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
natural. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awful.
So this tape, this negative tape would be going on for, upwards of, from the ages of 12, 13, when they would begin to develop and they'd have their first, wet dream or whatever, and start masturbating, So they'd be, 10, 11, 12, 13, and it would go on well into their 20s for, a decade or more.
Hmm.
So it would be very cemented into their self-esteem, and it would cause just severe self-esteem issues,
Right.
relationship issues, and sexual dysfunction issues.
Right.
And that's what I was seeing in their papers. And their symptomology looked exactly like someone who had experienced sexual abuse.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. So I'm hearing, their self-esteem being damaged and them feeling flawed, and I'm almost wondering if did you notice any promiscuity, like where they would maybe put themselves in positions sexually that could harm them, like being promiscuous and maybe sleeping with a lot of people, just because they didn't feel very good about themselves. I know that with sexual abuse, sometimes that can happen. So did you notice any of that in some of the
Well,
trends and what you
sometimes
found?
that was the case. Yeah, but often it was not intentional.
Right,
So
right. Okay.
if you are not given any information that can help you protect yourself, in other words, you're not
Yes.
given
The right
sexual
yeah.
knowledge,
Exactly.
you're only told that everything is bad,
Yes.
and you're not actually given the sexual knowledge, then you don't know when someone's trying to exploit you.
Right.
So then you are susceptible to somebody exploiting you. So, there would be many stories where somebody is like 13, 14, 15, and someone older, you know, says, talks them into doing something
Okay.
that they don't really want to do, perhaps, or they don't know that it could lead to something. And then all of a sudden they find themselves in a situation and they don't know how to get out of it.
Oh
And
gosh.
then they've gone along with something. And now they really condemn themselves,
Yes.
right? And now they're like, well, now that it's all happened, I'm a really horrible person. I'm a slut, I'm a whore, I'm a whatever, who cares?
Right.
Right. And so then they do find themselves being, promiscuous because they have blamed themselves for all of it,
Okay.
when really what happened is they were set up to be exploited,
Because,
and
yeah.
they were exploited.
Hmm.
Right. And none of it was their fault. They
Because,
weren't protected. They
right.
weren't given the information
Relation,
to protect
yes.
themselves.
Yeah.
Right. They were just put in a position to shame themselves.
Wow. Man.
Hmm.
And so we're going to talk
Yeah.
as we move along in this interview, we're going to talk about how important it is, the sexual education. I'm hoping by the end of these two episodes, because by the way, listeners, we're going to do a part one. This is part one, and then we're going to do part two. But by the end of this, I'm hoping that we can touch on and help some parents out there
Yeah.
understand the detriment of not having conversations. And we'll talk about not just that 100-minute conversation, but that you should have several conversations about,
Right.
sexual education and the detriment, that can happen if you do not. So we're planning to get into this. But so Tina, what I'm hearing is you started seeing these trends through your study. And so then what? That's what led you to decide to write the book?
Right, exactly. So as I began to see this, I started to speak out about it. I started to speak out and say, the church inadvertently has been colluding in a way with abstinence education and with silencing sex education, and actually putting kids in a position to condemn themselves and to promote sexual shame to such a degree that young people, are shaming themselves so much that they are exhibiting symptoms of someone who's experienced sexual abuse. And this is not what the church, I think, is intending to do,
Right.
but this is in fact what is happening by not providing sex education and by communicating to kids that they are not to feel sexual, not to think sexual thoughts, and not to act in any sexual way until they are heterosexually married, which was what was beginning to be which is what was communicated
Right.
in the purity movement, was actually backfiring in a
Yes.
significant way, and we were seeing a dramatic increase in sexual shame.
Okay.
And so I began to speak about it. I actually wrote my first article in 2006 in a journal called uh, I'm blanking on the name of it now, but anyway, that particular article, which was called "Christians Caught Between the Sheets: How an
Mm.
Abstinence-Only Ideology Hurts Us,"
Okay.
that article went viral, and I started to hear from people all around the world, and I thought, oh my goodness, I have really hit a
Touched on
nerve,
something.
because
Yes.
I just began to tell people what I was hearing from all of these students, then I started speaking about it at different conferences and places that I would go. And then just a few years ago, I had a PhD student who had been following my work, and she really wanted to do research on religious sexual shame. But when she got into the literature, what she found was there wasn't an operational definition on sexual shame.
Okay.
And so she did research on that. And meanwhile, I just started writing my book. And I asked a couple of questions because this is what people were asking of me. I asked, had Christianity ever been sex positive? And if it hadn't been sex positive, because Jesus really was sex and body positive, but if Christianity hadn't been sex and body positive, was the Abrahamic line, so people who, had been Christians or had been on the Jewish line, had there been any sex positivity there? Because obviously God made these bodies the way they were and made us hardwired for connection and pleasure. We know that babies, when they're born, infants are born, they immediately seek the breast. They smell the body. They are seeking the breast right away when they root.
Yeah.
And yet the breast milk doesn't come down for 2 or 3 days. We know that toddlers, and infants, if they do not get enough loving touch, they will suffer neurological damage.
Yes.
We know that when you walk down the halls of Alzheimer's units, people do not have to have memory, and they are still seeking connection and pleasure from each other. And that this is a challenging thing for people who work in Alzheimer's units to manage, because people are still seeking to be very touch oriented and sometimes even sexual, because this is hardwired into us.
Yeah.
And so we know that this is how we are made. And so I wanted to understand if it was somewhere communicated on the Abrahamic line, if God had communicated it somewhere in there. And so I went looking for that. And then I during all those years I was writing the book, which was 11 years, I developed a model for how you heal sexual shame, an evidence-based model for how you heal sexual shame. And then I put in the book touch and non-touch practices for how you can integrate sexuality and spirituality in a relationship, or even as you're working with yourself. And all of that I put in the book because people were asking for that. They were wondering, how can I understand this way of healing and being, but in a way that integrates my faith in a way that can make sense for me? And I think I needed to answer that for myself too, because I felt that I owed it to my students who were hurting so much,
to get those answers. Yeah.
So anyway, I had this student who ended up really wanting to understand sexual shame. And so she did this research study so that we would have an operational definition of sexual shame. And one of the things that was so stunning to me when she did her research, and this was really what I had been seeing with my students and seeing with clients, but when it came out in black and white, it moved me so much, because I think that we have a hard time appreciating how much sexual shame impacts people's ability to bond and attach in their most intimate relationships. And I don't know if there is another place that we could hurt people more than to sexually shame them.
Right.
Like, that's the place where we impact happiness the most. And sexual shame is really our first shame. Like, I so appreciate the work of Brene Brown. She has helped, I think, all of us in the United States and probably the globe understand shame, because I think so many of us didn't understand shame before then. But one of the things I've come to appreciate is that sexual shame, for most people, is their very first shame. And that's because in the United States, we don't have, because we don't have comprehensive sex education, and we haven't ever really, you have generations upon generations upon generations of people that are so shame filled around bodies and sexuality here in the United States.
I bet.
And so, yeah, so um, you've got infants who, if you've been around infants, their little hands are moving all over the place and they're kind of hitting their bodies and kind of, moving whatever. And right around 10 months old, an infant will start to more purposefully reach out.
For different
And
areas of their body. Yeah.
do I still have you?
Yes, I'm here. For different areas of their
And
body, right?
as they reach out, they will grab onto something
Right.
and they will kind of more purposefully reach for that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll realize that they've got some control over that. And somewhere around 10 months to a year, their hand will find its way to their genitals.
Right.
And that's the first time they'll discover that in their genitals, they have somewhere between 8,000 and 5,000 or 6,000 nerve endings.
Nerve endings.
The
Yes,
penis
exactly.
has between 5,000 and 6,000 nerve endings at the head of the penis, and the clitoris has about 8,000. And that's an exciting day. That's what I say.
Right.
That's an exciting day. And yet, and this is, when they're getting their diapers changed or they're in the tub or whatever. But if that parent or caregiver isn't comfortable with that discovery, they'll either yell at them and say, "That's dirty, don't," or they'll slap their hand away. And that right there doesn't make any sense to that infant. Now, mind you, that infant isn't thinking with their left brain because they don't have language yet. They're just functioning entirely out of their right brain, out of their artistic, playful brain.
Right.
And so at a visceral level, at a just a body level, their body level thinking is something is wrong with me, because they're just acting out of their natural curiosity and they have discovered something pleasurable. And yet this being that represents all love and all safety
Is saying no, no, no.
has just gotten
Scolded them.
angry with them.
Yeah.
Just scolded them. Exactly. And yet they're not going to not do that again. They are going to do that again. They're going to do that as many times as they can until they're 3, 4, 5, and they start to figure out that if they do it in front of you, they're going to get in trouble.
Right. So we'll do it
Because
in
by
secret.
that
Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
by that point, their thinking brain is online, right? But by then it's happened hundreds and hundreds of times that they've gotten scolded, and that shame has gone deep inside, and they have begun that thinking that something is wrong with me.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
I've been talking about this, Tina. I did an episode, episode 44, in which it's exclusively just me, and I'm talking about my different issues with, sex and, people and how we kind of feel about talking about it or feel about talking about God and sex. And I talk a
Yeah.
lot about how, we don't educate our youth and our children. I talk about the fact that, if your parents are probably in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, you probably didn't discuss it in your home. It was probably a silent environment, and it was something that you just had to kind of learn haphazardly on your own. And I also touch on the fact
Right.
that, what I'm finding with the church and Christian community, I'm a Christian. You're a Christian too, right, Tina?
Yeah. Yes,
What
I
I-
am.
yeah, what I'm finding is that there's this thing about talking about God, sex, and sexuality and pleasure and our bodies and all of that. So,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
Mm-hmm.
almost as
Mm-hmm.
though, I'll just say, I said this on the show. Since I started this show, I actually have people who I know from the church that have distanced themselves from me. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I do
Mm-hmm.
believe, I've kind of tossed it through my mind and kind of looked at, when this started to happen and, conversations that were had before it happened. And I can only come down to and conclude that it has something to do with my doing this show and being so open about talking about sex and sexuality
Mhm.
and, all of
Mhm.
this. I even had one
Yeah.
person say, well, you're talking about pleasure. And, so there is definitely something within the church body and church community where when you start to talk
Right.
about these topics and these issues, it's no so wonder,
Right.
Tina, what I'm saying,
Yes.
it's no so wonder that we have people that, have this shame. There are people that still
Right.
today are living with this. They may be married, they may be
Yep.
single,
Mhm.
and they still
Yep.
feel like it's something wrong to talk about it, to do it with their spouse, and all of that. And so that's really part of the reason why I'm doing this show, is because I'm hoping to educate and I'm hoping to kind of break down some of these barriers and the stigma, um,
Yeah.
about it, because I feel like there's a lot of damage that can happen. And that's why I said I want us to talk about it for a person before they're married, maybe even after they're married, or they may not even ever get
Right.
married as a result of some of the
Right.
thoughts that they're having around, this condemnation and, feeling bad about what I've done and what I'm thinking and, all of this. So I'm once again, I'm really
Right.
glad that you're on the show. So you
And I'm
started.
so glad you're doing it too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so
I,
much.
yeah.
So
Mhm.
on this part, I want us to we're going to go into part 2 and we're going to talk more about sexual shame, but I want to make sure we make the connection with the church and this topic. So what did you find out about the church, God, and this topic? What did you find out? What did you learn in your research?
Well, what I found out was, and I had just a whole host of grad assistants over the course of about 3 or 4 years who really helped me study the history of the development of the Christian church. So we just walked all the way back in history and really studied how the church had talked about and dealt with sexuality all the way back.
Yes.
And like, really followed it carefully. And what we found was that in the fourth century was really when the church formed its sexual ethic. And the sexual ethic that we still have today was really formed then. So we have how Jesus dealt with the body and sexuality. And so we have like the story of the woman brought for stoning. We
Yeah.
have the story of the woman at the well, and we know that, and we have the story of the woman who came in and broke the alabaster jar and on Jesus' feet and legs at the dinner party, and so we know that Jesus um, had this way of really seeing, knowing, loving, accepting people regardless of their background
Hmm.
and receiving their love and forgiving them and not condemning sexual sin, but forgiving and in seeing and loving and knowing he would set people free
Right.
to then live their best life, right?
Right.
And so you follow the centuries up and you follow the centuries back down. And what you find is in the fourth century, the church had been kind of scrambling to form itself. And then in the fourth century, Constantine was the emperor at that point, and Constantine became a Christian. And becoming a Christian gave him he had the power already, but becoming a Christian then and having the power then gave him the power in the new church to appoint then what would be the new church leaders of this new church. So it was the combination of the political power of being the emperor, then being able to then appoint the leaders of that new church. And what was happening in the Christian church at that point was the men who were of this new church were vying for power through basically a competition of who could be most spiritual through the denial of the body,
Mm.
through denial of pleasures, physical pleasure. through the denial of the body. That's what was happening at that time. And that's how they were saying who was more spiritual than someone else.
Oh.
And that became our sexual ethic. And when these men couldn't deny the body, or they would falter or fall or whatever, sin or whatever you want to call it, they then would blame the women in their lives.
Wow.
And right around the 11th century was when celibacy was instituted, and the men actually walked away from their marriages and left the women and children behind to fend for themselves. But in the 4th century was when they actually were doing the competing on who would be appointed, the bishops or whatever they were calling them then, the leaders in the church. So that became our sexual ethic. That sexual ethic, that competing on denying the body, that had nothing to do, you will not find that in Jesus' ministry. That is nowhere in Jesus' ministry. But that became our sexual ethic. So when I found that, I was like, well, this isn't Christian, if you will. That is not a part of Jesus' ministry. If Christianity is built on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, this ethic, this sexual ethic, is not part of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So then can I find something on the Abrahamic line that helps people, Christians, understand their sexuality in a way that feels in line with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, understand in line with Christianity, and in line with a loving, just God.
Okay.
That was the question I asked.
Okay.
So then I got knee deep, like more than knee deep, way above my head, actually, in Jewish Hebrew writing and in Jewish mystic writing. And I found some incredible stories that were in there that I had never, ever heard before.
Of course, yeah.
That are so beautiful, that just show that there is this relentless, loving God that uses sexuality, that uses loving, committed, engaged, intentional, loving touch to be a symbolic example of God's loving relationship with God's creation. Over and over again. Wow. You just see this example over and over again. I could give you a couple of them, but one of them, for example, is we hear about how inside the Holy of Holies there were golden angels over the Ark of the Covenant and on the top of 2 staffs. And we would hear about them. Well, I always heard that they were always with their wings out over the Ark of the Covenant, showing God's protection over God's people. That's how I always heard about them. And so I thought that they were always that way. So there were several buildings and then destroying of the different temples across time. So I always thought, well, when it was rebuilt, they were always that way. Well, that wasn't the case. In every rebuilding of the temple, the cherubim were in a different depiction, showing something different about God's character. And in the very last temple, the temple that was destroyed in 72 AD, the cherubim were in seated sexual embrace.
Wow.
So the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant and the cherubim on the 2 staffs. And there are first century priests or rabbis this is written about in several places, are known to have, once a year, they would pull the paraclete, that big, heavy curtain that was like 4 inches thick. They would pull it aside and show the rest of the people that were on the other side. They would show them so that they could see inside, and they could see these golden cherubim that they were sitting and seated in place. They would show them, and they would say to the people, "This is so you can know that God loves you like a lover and longs for you like a lover.
Wow.
And when I read that, I remember I was camping with a bunch of my friends, family friends, and I remember reading it and the first time, and I thought to myself, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe what I'm reading." And if I told people, they wouldn't believe me. I'm going to have to find this in at least two other sources
Yeah.
before I can tell anybody, because people will think I'm out of my mind,
Right.
right? But then I also thought, how would we as Christians have a different relationship with God
If we knew,
if
yeah.
we thought of God as our lover and not just our father?
Wow.
And how would we have a different relationship with sexuality if we thought of God as a lover and not just a father?
Wow.
Right?
Interesting.
So that's
Yes.
right. That's just one of about 8 stories that are in the book. And they are stunning. They are so beautiful. And you just realize how loved you are and what
Yes.
a gift your sexuality is, which makes you feel like I need to take care of my sexuality. Like I need to have it be a part of my life in a way that it blesses me
Yeah.
and blesses anybody that I bring into it.
Right. And that you
It
don't need
makes
to, yeah,
you
that you don't
it
need to
makes
be
you feel good
ashamed.
about it.
Yes, exactly. That you don't need to be
No.
ashamed. Exactly. All
Mm-mm.
right. Well, I
Mm-mm.
tell you what, this is great, Tina. Mind blowing, really. I'm at a loss of words with everything that you've said. But it's interesting, and thank you for being so brave to go into that study and to find out that information, because I just know there's probably people who are listening that, probably had this idea or this thought about God and sex and our sexuality and intimacy and all of that. And probably have thought the opposite. And so I'm so glad that you did
Yes.
this research. And we're going to talk more. This is going to
Okay.
conclude part one of this episode of the Lovers Lounge podcast, where we talk to experts and other guests on topics related to love, relationships, and sex. Of course, I'm your host, Tina Love, and stay tuned because we'll be back with Dr. Tina Schermer-Sellers to talk more about her book, sexual shame, and so much other things. So stay tuned.